Hello everyone and welcome back to Rambling Through History. My name is Jacob. Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest conquerors and kings of the early medieval era, Charlemagne. This is going to be one of my longest projects to date, and I hope you guys truly do enjoy. And when you guys do see this, I will not be uploading a video for probably a week or two because I'll be in my hometown celebrating Christmas and most likely New Year's with my family. With that, I hope you guys also have a wonderful Christmas, a happy holidays, but with that, let's get on with the video. Around the time of birth of Charlemagne, conventionally held to be 742, but most likely 747 or 748, his father, Pippin III, was mayor of the palace, and an official serving the Merovingian king, but actually wielding effective power over the extensive Frankish kingdom. What little is known about Charlemagne's youth suggests that he received practical training for leadership by participating in the political, social, and military activities associated with his father's court. His early years were marked by a succession of events that had immense implications for the Frankish position in the contemporary world. In 751, with papal approval, Pippin seized the Frankish throne from the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. After meeting with Pope Stephen II at the royal palace at Pantheon in 753 to 754, Pippin forged an alliance with the Pope by committing himself to protect Rome in return for papal sanction of the right to Pippin's dynasty to the Frankish throne. Pippin also intervened militarily in Italy in 755 and 756 to restrain Lombard threats to Rome. And in the so-called Donation of Pippin in 756, he bestowed on the papacy a block of territory stretching across central Italy, which formed the basis of a new political entity, the Papal States over which the Pope ruled. When Pippin died in 768, his realm was divided according to Frankish custom between Charlemagne and his brother, Carloman. Almost immediately, the rivalry between the two brothers threatened the unity of the Frankish kingdom. Seeking advantage over his brother, Charlemagne formed an alliance with the Desiderius, king of the Lombards, accepting as his wife the daughter of the king to seal an agreement that threatened the delinquent equilibrium that had been established in Italy by Pippin's alliance with the papacy. The death of Carloman in 771 ended the mounting crisis, and Charlemagne, disregarding the rights of Carloman's heirs, took control of the entire Frankish realm. Charlemagne assumed rulership at a moment when powerful forces of change were affecting his kingdom. By Frankish tradition, he was a warrior king, expected to lead his followers in wars that would expand Frankish hegemony and produce rewards for his companions. His Merovingian predecessors had succeeded remarkably well as conquerors, but their victories resulted in a kingdom made up of diverse peoples over which unified rule grew increasingly difficult. Complicating the situation for the Merovingian kings were both the insatiable appetite of the Frankish aristocracy for wealth and power, and the constant partitioning of the Frankish realm that resulted from the custom of treating the kingdom as a patrimony to be divided among all male heirs surviving each king. By the early 8th century, these forces had reduced the Merovingian rulers to what their Carolinian successors dubbed do-nothing kings. Real power had been assumed by the aristocratic dynasty, later called the Carolinians after Charlemagne, which during 7th century clawed its way to dominance by utilizing the office of mayor of the palace to establish control over the royal administration and royal resources and to build a following strong enough to fend off a rival Frankish family seeking comparable power. During the 8th century, the Catalonian mayors of the palace Charles Martel, 714 to 741, and prior to becoming king, Pippin III of 741 to 751, increasingly turned their attention to activities aimed at checking the political fragmentation of Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne was thus heir to a long tradition that measured a king by his successes at war, which in turn required him to devise means of governance capable of sustaining control over an increasingly big population. New forces were at work in the mid-8th century to complicate the traditional role of the Frankish kingship. As a result of Pippin's reliance on the existential authority to legitimate his deposition for the Merovingian dynasty and his usurpation of royal office, the Carolinians had become, in the idiom of time, rulers by the grace of God, a role that imposed on them new, not yet clearly defined powers and responsibilities. The assumption of that new burden came at a time when religious renewal was gathering momentum to add a new dimension to the forces defining, directing, and sustaining the Christian community. The 8th century witnessed intellectual and artistic stirrings throughout the Latin Christendom, which focused on re-establishing contact with the classical and patriarch past as a crucial requirement for the renewal of a Christian society. The Frankish social system, which had been based on kinship ties, on bonds linking war leaders and their comrades in arms, and on ethnicity, was being overlaid by social bonds created when one individual commended himself to another, thereby accepting condition of personal dependence that entailed the rendering of services to the superior and returning for material considerations granted to the dependent party. Moreover, the world beyond Francia was being reshaped politically and economically by the declining of the Eastern Roman Empire. The triumphant advance of Arab forces and their Islamic religion across the Mediterranean world, and the threat posed by new Scandinavian, Slavic, and Central Asian invaders. The distinguishing mark of Charlemagne's reign was his effort to honor the age-old custom and expectations of the Frankish kingship. While responding creatively to the new forces impinging on society, his personal qualities served him well in confronting that challenge. The ideal warrior chief, Charlemagne was an imposing physical presence blessed with extraordinary energy, personal courage, and an iron will. He loved the active life, military campaigning, hunting, swimming, but he was no less at home at court. Generous with his gifts, a boon companion at the banquet table, and adept at establishing friendships. Never far from his mind was his large family. 5 wives in sequence, several concubines, and at least 18 children over whose interests he watched carefully. Although he received only an elementary level of formal education, Charlemagne possessed considerable native intelligence, intellectual curiosity, a willingness to learn from others, and religious sensibility, all attributes which allowed him to comprehend the forces that were reshaping the world about him. These facets of his persona combined to make him a figure worthy of respect, loyalty, and affection. He was a leader capable of making informed decisions, willing to act on those decisions, and skilled at persuading others to follow him. The first 3 decades of Charlemagne's reign was dominated by military campaigns, which were prompted by a variety of factors. The need to defend his realm against external foes and internal separatists, a desire for conquest and loot, a keen sense of opportunities offered by changing power relationships, and an urge to spread Christianity. His performance on the battlefield earned him fame as a warrior king in the Frankish tradition, one who would make the Franks a force in the world once contained in the Roman Empire. Charlemagne's most demanding military undertaking pitted him against the Saxons, longtime adversaries of the Franks, whose conquest required more than 30 years of campaigning, from 772 to 804. This long struggle, which led to the annexation of a large block of territory between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, was marked by pillaging, broken truces, hostage takings, mass killings, deportation of rebellious Saxons, draconian measures to compel acceptance of Christianity, and occasional Frankish defeats. The Frisians, Saxon allies living in the North Sea east of the Rhine, were also forced into submission. While the conquest of Saxony was in progress, Charlemagne undertook other campaigns. As soon as he became the sole king in 771, he repudiated his Lombard wife and his alliance with her father, King Desiderius. Soon after, in 773 to 774, he answered the appeals of Pope Adrian I for protection by leading a victorious expedition into Italy, which ended with his assumption of the Lombard crown and the annexation of northern Italy. During his campaign, Charlemagne went to Rome to reaffirm the Frankish protectorate over the papacy and to confirm papal rights to territories conceded by Charlemagne's father. Additional campaigns were required to incorporate the Lombard kingdom fully into the Frankish realm. However, an important step in that process came in 781 when Charlemagne created a sub-kingdom of Italy with his son Pippin as king. Concerned with defending southern Gaul from Muslim attacks and beguiled by promises of help from local Muslim leaders in northern Spain, who sought to escape the authority of the Umbad leader of Cordoba, Charlemagne invaded Spain in 778. The ill-considered venture ended in a disastrous defeat of the retreating Frankish army by Gascon forces. Immortalized 3 centuries later in the epic poem The Song of Roland, despite this setback, Charlemagne persisted in his effort to make the frontier in Spain more secure. In 781, he created a sub-kingdom of Aquitaine with his son Louis as king. From that the base Frankish forces mounted a series of campaigns that eventually established Frankish control over the Spanish March, the territory lying between the Pyrenees and the Ebro River. In 787 to 788, Charlemagne forcibly annexed Bavaria, whose leaders had long resisted Frankish overlordship. That victory brought the Franks face to face with the Avars, ecstatic nomads who, during the late 6th and 7th centuries, had formed an extensive empire largely inhabited by the conquered Slavs living on both sides of the Danube. By the 8th century, Avar power was in decline, and the successful Frankish campaigns in 791, 795, and 796 hastened with the disintegration of that empire. Charlemagne captured a huge store of loot, claimed a block of territory south of the Danube in Carthagia and Pannonia, and opened a missionary field that led to the conversion of the Avars and their former Slavic subjects to Christianity. Charlemagne's military successes resulted in an ever-lengthening frontier which needed to be defended. Through a combination of military force and diplomacy, he established relatively stable relations with a variety of potentially dangerous enemies, including the Danish kingdom, several Slavic tribes inhabiting the territory along the eastern frontier, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans, the Lombard Duchy of Benevento in southern Italy, the Muslims in Spain, and the Gascons and Bretons in Gaul. The Italian scene was complicated by the Papal States, whose boundaries remained problematic and whose leader, the Pope, had no clearly defined political status relative to the Frankish protector, now his neighbor as King of Lombards in general. Charlemagne's relations with the papacy, especially with Pope Adrian I, were positive and brought him valuable support for his religious program and praise for his qualities as a Christian leader. The expanded Frankish presence in Italy and the Balkans intensified diplomatic encounters with the Eastern emperors, which strengthened the Frankish position with respect to the Eastern Roman Empire. Weakened by internal dimension and threatened by Muslim and Bulgar pressure on his eastern and northern frontiers, Charlemagne also established friendly relations with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the Anglo-Saxon kings of Mercia and Northumbria, and the ruler of the Christian kingdom of the Asturias in northwestern Spain. And he enjoyed a vague role as protector of the Christian establishment in Jerusalem. By boldly and resourcefully combining the traditional role of warrior king with aggressive diplomacy based on a good grasp of current political realities, Charlemagne elevated the Frankish kingdom to the position of leadership in the European world. Charlemagne's military conquests, diplomacy, and efforts to impose a unified administration on his kingdom were impressive proof of his ability to play the part of a traditional Frankish king. His religious policy reflected his capacity to respond positively to forces of change working in his world. With considerable enthusiasm, he expanded and intensified the reform program rather than halting instituted in the 740s by his father Pippin and his uncle Carloman. In essence, Charlemagne's response to the growing urge in his world to deepen spiritual life was to make the object as a prime concern of public policy and royal governance. His program for meeting his royal religious responsibilities was formulated in a series of synods made up of both clerics and laymen summoned by royal order to consider an agenda set by the royal court. The enactments of the councils were given the force of law in royal capitularies, which all royal officials, but especially bishops, were expected to enforce. That legislation, traditional in spirit and content, was inspired by a conviction that the Normans required to correct the deficiencies besetting Christian life in the 8th century had already been defined by Scripture and by earlier church councils and ecclesiastical authorities. The reform focused on a few major concerns: strengthening the church hierarchical structure, clarifying the powers and responsibilities of that hierarchy, improving the intellectual and moral quality of the clergy, protecting and expanding resources, standardizing liturgical practices, intensifying pastoral care aimed at general understanding of the basic tenets of the faith and improvements of morals, rooting out paganism. As the reform movement progressed, its scope broadened to vest the ruler with authority to discipline clerics, to assert control over property, to propagate the faith, and to divine orthodox doctrine. Despite extending his authority over matters traditionally administered by the church, Charlemagne's aggressive moves to direct religious life won the acceptance from the establishment, including the papacy. In assessing clerical support of the king's religious policy, it is necessary to keep in mind that the king controlled the appointment of bishops and abbots, which was a major benefactor of the clerical establishment and was the guarantor of the papal states. Nonetheless, the clergy's support was genuine, reflecting its approval of the king's desire to strengthen structures and to deepen the piety and correct the morals of the Christian subjects. That approval was expressed in the glorification of the king in his own day as erector of the new Israel. The court circle played a key role in producing manuals required to teach Latin, to expound the basic tenets of the faith, and to perform works that permitted a deeper exploration of Latin learning and the Christian faith. A royal scriptorium was established, which played an important role of propagating the Catalonian minuscule, a new writing system that made copying and reading easier, and in experimenting with art forms useful in decorating books and in transmitting visually the message contained in them. Members of the court circle comprised poetry, historiography, biblical exegesis, theological tracts, and epistles, works that exemplified advanced levels of intellectual activity and linguistic expertise. Their efforts propagated Alcuin to boast that a new Athens was in the making in Francia. The new Athens came to be identified with Aachen from about 794, Charlemagne's favorite royal residence. Aachen was the center of a major building program that included the Palestine Chapel, a masterpiece of Catalonian architecture that served as Charlemagne's imperial church. Royal derivatives and the cultural models provided by the court circle were quickly imitated in cultural centers across the kingdom where signs of renewal were already emerging. Bishops and abbots, sometimes with the support of lay magnates, sought to revitalize existing and monastic schools and to found new ones, and measures were taken to increase the number of students. Some schoolmasters went beyond elementary Latin education to develop curricula and compile textbooks in traditional 7 liberal arts. The number of scriptura, or their productive capacity, increased dramatically, and the number and size of libraries expanded, especially in monasteries, where book collections often included classical texts whose only surviving copies were made for those libraries. Although the full fruits of the Catalonian Renaissance emerged only after Charlemagne's death, the consequences of his cultural program appeared already during his lifetime in improved competence in Latin, the expanded use of written documents in civil and administration, advanced levels of discourse and stylistic versatility in form of literary productions, enriches liturgical usages, and techniques and motifs employed in architecture and the visual arts. Charlemagne's prodigious range of activities during the first 30 years of his reign were prelude to what some contemporaries and many later observers viewed as the culminating event of his reign, his coronation as Roman Emperor. In considerable part, that event was the consequence of an idea shaped by the interpretation given to Charlemagne's actions as ruler. Over the years, some of the king's chief political, religious, and cultural advisors became convinced that a new community was taking shape under the aegis of the king and the Frankish people whom, as one pope avowed, the Lord God of Israel has blessed. They spoke of that community as Imperium Christendom, comprising all who adhered to the Orthodox faith proclaimed by the Roman Church. This community accepted the new dominion of the monarch, increasingly hailed as the new David and the new Constantine, the guardian of Christendom and the executor of God's will. Concern for the welfare of Imperium Christendom was heightened by the perceived unfitness of the heretical emperors in Constantinople to claim authority over the Christian community, especially after a woman, Irene, became Eastern Emperor in 797. In a larger sense, developments in the 8th century produced the perception in Catalonian world that the Latin West and the Greek East were diverging in ways that negated the universal claims of the Eastern emperors. On the assessment of Charlemagne's years as emperor, historians are not in full accord. Some have seen the period as one of emerging crisis, in which activities of the aging emperor were increasingly constricted. Because Charlemagne no longer led successful military ventures, the resources with which to reward loyal followers declined. At the same time, new external enemies appeared to threaten the realm, especially seagoing Northmen and Sacronins. There were also signs of structural inadequacy in the system of government, which constantly took upon itself new responsibilities without a increase in human or material resources, and growing resistance to royal control by lay and magnates who began to grasp the political, social, and economic power to be derived from royal grants of land and immunities. Other historians, however, have stressed such things as increased royal concern for the helpless, Continued efforts to strengthen royal administration, active diplomacy, the maintenance of religious reform, and support of cultural renewal, all of which seen as evidence during Charlemagne's last years. Within this larger context, there were developments that suggest that the imperial title meant little to its recipient. Indeed, in 802, when he first formally used the endonymic title Emperor governing the Roman Empire, he retained his old title of King of Franks and the Lombards. He continued to live in his traditional Frankish way, eschewed modes of conduct and protocol associated with imperial dignity. He relied less on the advice of the circle that had shaped the ideology that led to the revival of the Roman Empire. Indeed, the emperor seemed oblivious to the idea of a unified political entity implicit in the imperial title when, in 806, he decreed that on his death his realm would be divided among his 3 sons. Other evidence, however, indicates that the imperial title was important to him. Charlemagne engaged in a long military and diplomatic campaign that finally, in 1812, gained recognition of his title from the Eastern Roman Empire. After 800, his religious reform program stressed changes in behavior that implied that membership in the Imperium Christendom required new modes of public conduct. He attempted to bring greater uniformity to the diverse legal system prevailing in his empire, the terminology and symbols employed by the court to set forth its policies, and the artistic motifs employed in the building complex at Aachen reflected an awareness of the imperial office as a source of ideological elements capable of buttressing the ruler's authority. In 813, Charlemagne assured the perpetration of the imperial title by bestowing with his own hands the imperial crown on his only surviving son, Louis the Pious. The coronation of 1813 suggests that Charlemagne believed that the office had some value and that he wished to exclude the papacy from any part in its bestowal. In its entirety, the evidence leads to the conclusion that Charlemagne saw the imperial title as a personal award in recognition of his services to Christendom, to be used as fit to enhance his ability that one of his heirs to direct the Imperium Christendom to its divinely ordained end. In January of 814, Charlemagne fell ill with a fever after bathing in his beloved warm springs at Aachen. He died 1 week later. Writing in the 840s, the emperor's grandson, the historian Nithard, avowed that at the end of his life, the great king had left all of Europe filled with every goodness. Modern historians have made apparent of the exaggeration in that statement by calling attention to the inadequacies of Charlemagne's political apparatus, the limitations of his military forces in the new face of new threats from seafaring foes, the failure of his religious reforms to affect the great mass of Christians, the narrow traditionalism and clerical bias of his cultural program, and the oppressive features of his economic and social programs. Such critical attention of Charlemagne's role, however, cannot affect the fact that his effort to adjust traditional Frankish ideas of leadership and the public good to a new current in society made a crucial difference in European history. His renewal of the Roman Empire in the West provided the ideological foundation for a politically unified Europe, an idea that inspired Europeans ever since, sometimes with unhappy consequences. His feats as a ruler, both real and imagined, served as a standard to which many generations of European rulers looked for his guidance in defining and discharging their royal functions. His religious reforms solidified the organizational structures and the liturgical practices that eventually folded most of Europe into a single church. His definition of the role of the secular authority in directing religious life laid the basis for the tension-filled interaction between temporal and spiritual authority that played a crucial role in shaping both political and religious institutions in later Western European history. His cultural renaissance provided the basic tools, schools, curricula, textbooks, libraries, and teaching techniques upon which later cultural revivals would be based. The impetus he gave to the lord-vassal relationship and to the system of agriculture known as manorialism, in which peasants held land from the lord in exchange for dues and services, played a vital role in establishing the system in which lords exercised political and economic power over a given territory and its population. The seigneurial system, in turn, had the potential for imposing political and social order and for stimulating economic growth. Such accomplishments certainly justify superlatives by which he was known in his own time: Carlius Magnus, Charles the Great, and Europe Pater, Father of Europe. And with that, that'll be the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for coming all the way to the end of this video. I truly do appreciate it because this was my first extremely long video and I am very happy with the way it turned out. Hopefully you guys did enjoy as well. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment down below any new ideas that you have for me or just anything you would like to say on this topic. Once again, thank you guys so much and I hope you guys have a happy holidays, happy Christmas, and I'll see you guys soon.